Bonjour, chers amis, chers frères, chères sœurs. C'est très bien d'être avec vous-même, si ce n'est que dans virtuel. J'avais espéré pouvoir vous rejoindre là-bas en France cette année. Mais il semble que cela devra attendre un autre avenir. Comme beaucoup de vous le savez, après tant d'années sans parler français, c'est un peu difficile pour moi ces jours. Donc, s'il vous plaît, pardonnez-moi parce que maintenant je parle en anglais. Merci. The subject matter, the theme for your conference in France, as always, seems to be especially appropriate, especially good. It's been a good theme for the last few thousand years, and it seems to be getting better. Know thyself. The classic expression that has been written above the doorway to the Oracle of Delphi and has been repeated throughout history. Probably either explicitly or implicitly, this is a spiritual directive, a command, an invitation that is given in every valid spiritual tradition. In Islam, the Prophet Muhammad said, "He who knows himself knows God." Ramana Maharshi's persistent question was to ask ourselves and to try to discover, who am I? In the Christian scriptures, the word is said that I, these are the words that are spoken from the mouth of the monad or the Christ consciousness, I and the Father are one. Yoga tradition talks about the coming together of Purusha and Prakriti, spirit and matter. And of course, in the theosophical approach, we speak about the three schemes of evolution: the spiritual, the intellectual, the physical, that combine and result in the human being. So, who am I? And knowing thyself is the admonition that comes down to us throughout the ages and through every tradition and every great person, great teacher who has walked the earth. You would think that in the thousands of years that this has been explored, that it would be safe to say that by now we should be able to say, yes, I do know myself. Or yes, I feel that I am close to knowing myself, at least. But the question keeps coming back again and again. The admonition is stated again and again: know thyself. So probably we should ask ourselves a couple of questions. One of those being that if this thing has been repeated so much, what is it about self-knowledge that is so difficult if over the thousands of years that this has been put before us, we seem to be no closer? What is it that is so difficult? And actually, why is it that this is even stated? For every one of us, I mean, one of the clear things, the expression from one of your very famous French people, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. The existence of this I, this self, is the very basis of human existence. And it's something that is the closest thing to us. Every single moment of every single day that we live and breathe, we are functioning through this self. So why should it be termed so difficult for us to actually know what this self is? And what is it that I don't know? Might be another question. You take your normal day in a normal life. Each one of us wakes up in a bed. That bed is situated in a particular neighborhood, in a particular nation. When we get up from bed, we take care of the body which we inhabit and work through every single day. And we wash it, we clean it, we do all the things we need to do. Each one of us will probably, upon awakening in today's world, on awakening or shortly thereafter, will check our smartphone to see what texts, what emails, and the occasional call that may have actually come in for us. And this is something that is directed toward a specific self that we are very aware of, either our professional self, calls or texts from friends, associates, family. We recognize these selves. We function through these selves, moment to moment, day to day. Each of these I's, each of these selves have been lived in, have been developed, and have been explored for years through the course of our living. So I think it would be mistaken for us to say that we have no knowledge of self, because we do. But then again, that's something that actually causes other questions. And in this case, deeper questions to arise. The fact of the matter is that there is a certain power that derives from anything that we point to, anything that we claim as ourself. Whatever we identify as self, as me, as I, becomes the directing center of our actions, of our thoughts, of our attitudes. This is the role of the ego. And so in psychological practice, the idea is to try and understand the sorts of currents that are moving and shaping this ego. That's something that is often a lifetime's attempt, a lifetime's effort. But each of these identities has a certain claim and represents itself through us in the world from day to day. The fact of the matter is that we as human beings are quite complex. One of the fundamental ideas that is put forward in the theosophical teachings has been this idea that we are multi-dimensional beings within a multi-dimensional universe. We are not just one thing. Certainly we are not just beings who are linked solely with a physical existence, although that is something that is a part of who I am, in a sense. So the deeper sort of understanding that we end up having to go into is some sort of questioning and some sort of examination of these various layers of self. All of these are in the spiritual practices of the world. There are approaches that are recommended toward trying to come to grips with what it is and who it is I am. The process of knowing thyself. So perhaps during our time together, we will be able to give some consideration to not only who this self is, but in what way we can respond to a deepening engagement with what is pointed toward from these many traditions as a very deep level of self. So just to say a little bit about the complexity of self. There is the indication that has been given in the early teachings of the Theosophical Society. I find myself coming back to many of these things quite frequently. In HPB's approach, she speaks about the nature of the human being. What is a human being? And at the core, what she speaks about is that the human being is highest spirit, lowest matter, linked by mind. In places, she talks about the three evolutionary schemes that are interwoven in the human being and give the human existence the complexity that we end up having to work our way through. Those streams being the monadic or spiritual, the intellectual or monastic stream, and then, of course, the physical stream. But the agent that links all of these is the mind. It is the mind that brings together, that is the bridge between the spiritual stream and the physical stream. So human life and the human problem and the issue of know thyself is something that is rooted and centered in this mind. Mind not as the brain and its functioning, although that's certainly a part of it, but mind as this linking agency. So our understanding of this and our ability to interact with it is the actual key that opens the door to self-knowledge. Self-knowledge has been described as the longest journey to the nearest place. It's a journey of countless lifetimes in order to find ourselves once again at the doorway of that which has been ever present. St. Francis was fond of saying that what you are looking for is what is looking. So the journey of outgoing that is described in the scriptures of the world, the prodigal son, the hymn of the pearl in the Gnostic Gospels, the sons going out from the house of the Father, leaving the state of unity and moving into a state of association with the physical world, once again returning, is the description. It's the story. It's the constant myth that speaks to self-knowledge. This longest journey to return with the fruits of knowledge to the place where this journey actually began. So, what is it that we know? What is the state of our self-knowledge? And so, in our particular phase of development, in Buddhism, there are many different things that are described, but there is an ancient teaching tool. Probably it even predates Buddhism, formal Buddhism. But it's a pictorial tool that made it possible for people to actually internalize and to remember, to visually be able to understand some of these profound ideas that were being put forward. HPB refers to it on occasion in The Secret Doctrine and elsewhere in speaking about the nidanas, the 12 interdependent, interrelated links that lead to the process of life. It has a more complicated name. The 12 interdependent links of origination is the complicated way to say it. But basically, the 12 links that root us in a consciousness that is removed from what might be described as genuine self-knowledge. It's describing the process of samsara, the process of birth, self-indoctrination, death, and then rebirth. This wheel that we find ourselves engaged in from life to life to life. And what is spoken of, the very first of the links in this chain, is spoken of as ignorance. And there is a visual depiction that gives an image of what ignorance is. So, ignorance. And in our conventional way of thinking, we think of ignorance in a very specific way. Someone is ignorant if they don't know. If they don't know some fact. Someone can be ignorant of physics if they've never had a college or high school level education along that line, is the way we conventionally use the term. In terms of the Buddhist terms, or in terms really of the types of ignorance that is described by H.P. Blavatsky and others, there is a deeper meaning. Not more complicated, but certainly a deeper meaning. Whereas conventionally we think of ignorance as not knowing, from the spiritual perspective, ignorance equals wrong knowing. It's not absence of knowledge, it's a fullness of a very distorted and incorrect perception of reality. We're not without self-knowledge. It's just that the nature of what we think we know is completely incorrect. So that's a part of this problem, and that's part of the difficulty of untangling it. Because, again, our general approach to matters of the spiritual life is, because of our long-term training in an incorrect perception of what is real, we have cultivated certain approaches to living that we feel are appropriate. You know, one of them would be that when we find that there is some knowledge that we do not possess, we seek for it. We seek to add that knowledge through some source with which we're familiar. Generally, we'll look in a book. We'll ask someone, to tell us and give us the missing piece. We tend to want to add something to our understanding. And with that approach, we end up piling up more and more knowledge, but knowledge that is in many ways not only not useful, but counterproductive. So what is it that we could think in terms of as an approach, as a process in which the mind might be somewhat liberated, or at least in the beginning, mildly relieved of some of our layers of misperception. There's a wonderful quote. There are similar ones throughout the spiritual traditions of the world, but there's one that I find, at least for me, resonates quite deeply. And it comes from the Sufi tradition. It was said by the great mystic Rumi. And in his quote, he uses the word love. Love could mean reality, love could mean wisdom, which essentially, as we understand love appropriately, it's all of those things. But the quote is this. Rumi says that your task is not to seek for love. So, not to seek for love, for wisdom, for reality. So your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek for and find every barrier within yourself that you have built against love. It's a description of a very different process. In fact, it's a complete different direction for our consciousness. It's not about seeking for wisdom, seeking for knowledge of the self, seeking for love. It's about the ever-presence of this love, this wisdom, this reality that we go out in search of, and that the actual process that reveals it to us, the process that we engage in, and when we engage in it correctly, the one that allows the experience of self-knowledge, is a process of seeking for those obstructions, those barriers that we have constructed within ourselves. And even in this expression of Rumi's, it's not about seeking for and then removing. You seek and you find, and that's as far as his description goes. Because the fact of the matter is that this sense that we can actively extract these barriers that we have created is, again, an influence of a way of thinking that has been generated by a wrong perception of who I am. The seeing, the clear seeing of the obstacle in and of itself causes that obstacle to dissipate, to dissolve. It's nothing we have to do in that respect. So this is a profound reversal in approach. And so what is it that we are looking for? What is it that we are trying to see that then needs to be addressed? And again, because we are such multi-dimensional beings, there are various things going on at all levels of our being. Let me just share a couple of quotes from the Mahatma letters that give indications about the depth of our engagement with these distracting energies. So here's one, and it comes from the first letter written by K.H. to A.O. Hume. Very profound message that it has. So I'll just read part of it. It says that every thought of man, upon being evolved, passes into the inner world and becomes an active entity by associating itself with an elemental. And by elemental, he says, that is to say, with one of the semi-intelligent forces of the kingdom. So it survives as an active intelligence, a creature of the mind's begetting. So every thought that we generate, every thought that flows out of our mind passes into the inner world and associates itself with one of the various life forms that are there. And, the inner worlds, we make a big mistake. In the Hermetic axiom, there's the idea expressed that in the spiritual life, one of the things we need to keep in mind is this Hermetic axiom. So the idea that as it is above, so it is below. As it is without, so it is within. So we look at the outer world, and everywhere we look, there is an abundance of life, of living things, creatures, animals, plants, microbes. And each one has its own needs and its own ways of expressing. Some of those things are beneficial for our particular direction. Some of them are not. Some of those things, anyone who has a yard, who puts out a bird feeder, you put out a particular form of nourishment, and you attract birds of a particular type. You put out sugar, you attract hummingbirds. You put out sugar, you attract bees. Various life forms are attracted. We recognize this, and we know this in the world that we see with our outer eyes. But then again, as it is without, in our day-to-day living, we fail to remember and acknowledge that the exact same process is going on with every one of our thoughts. It is a form of nourishment that is attractive to a variety of intelligent or semi-intelligent life forms. And so then what's the result of that? This letter goes on to say, and so man, or the human being, is continually peopling his current in space with a world of his own, crowded with the offsprings of his fancies, desires, impulses, and passions, a current which reacts upon any sensitive or nervous organization which it comes in contact with. So that's the dynamic. That's the dynamic of just sitting in one place, thinking thoughts, developing and expanding emotions that we attract. We people our current in space, is this way of describing. And we are affected by that. So all of these things, the angry person tends to get angrier. The greedy person tends to become greedier. The peaceful person tends to be more peaceful, because we attract those things which feed upon and which magnify that experience. In another part of the letter, it says that the average person these things just are thrown out of his mind unconsciously. But to someone who has actually some level of development, they are consciously created and consciously evolved and consciously directed. So that's one quote. And again, that comes from the first letter from K.H. to A.O. Hume. Another quote, which I'll just read part of, and I find it quite interesting because, again, it describes something of the nature of this process Rumi described. What is it we're to do? To seek and find all of those things which we have created, which are barriers. All of those things we have invited, which become barriers. So this was in a letter about the some of the difficulties that were encountered with trying to communicate with the early people to whom these letters were being written. A.P. Sinnett, A.O. Hume. So in this letter, it's spoken about, it says that they may have bad influences around them of the type that we have just talked about. Bad magnetic emanations, which are the result of drink, of society, and what he describes as the promiscuous physical associations. So a different sort of promiscuity he's talking about, because he says, resulting even from shaking hands with impure people. But all of this are physical and material impediments, and with little effort those could be counteracted. Goes on to say, this is not so with the magnetism and invisible results proceeding from erroneous and sincere beliefs. Faith in the gods and God and other superstitions attract millions of foreign influences, living entities and powerful agents. It attracts those around them. So again, these are quotes, and these are in many ways hints about some of the necessities involved in this process of self-knowledge. In The Voice of the Silence, a certain formula is given by H.P. Blavatsky. Again, very often we read the words and we look at it as things that are well said, sound advice, but really this one is really a formula for this process of self-knowledge. She says that self-knowledge is of loving acts the child. Self-knowledge is born of loving acts, actions. Often we think of love as a feeling. And, depending on who it is that says they're in love or they have love, that feeling is expressed very differently. Everything from teenage lust to, the highest sense of union with the divine is the range of what, depending on our development, we call love. And our sense of love is necessarily limited. So self-knowledge is born out of loving acts. So the idea for us then is to kind of clear away whatever degree of misunderstanding, whatever degree of ignorance, of wrong knowledge we have about the nature of love, so that the actions that we take can be in harmony with that. And out of that harmonious activity, the experience of self-knowledge is born. It's a formula, really. So what is it? How do we approach this? And again, we can make it as complicated, we can make it as difficult as we choose to. But I don't know if it's just my disposition, my temperament, but I find that really always there is the possibility of great complexity. That's something that is always, it's ever present. But in terms of the essence, some of these things are very, very simple and have been very simply expressed. So probably if we are looking, if we are engaged genuinely in this process of self-knowledge, trying to know ourselves. The sorts of accumulations of barriers that we have spoken of and that were written about in these Mahatma letters, that probably is the first place to begin. And so we could talk in terms of we begin by cleansing, clearing, purifying. And it's not a difficult concept. I mean, quite honestly, again, if we maintain our attention to this hermetic axiom, as it is without, so it is within, every single day that we wake up in the morning, all of us have a certain routine. And generally, when we wake up in the morning, we brush our teeth. We nowadays, more than ever, part of our daily regimen is we are continually washing our hands. Why? Every day, if we listen to the advice of the dentists, we are brushing our teeth 3 times a day and washing our hands however many times we touch anything beyond our own body. That's the regimen for today. Why? Because we recognize, it is recognized, that over time we accumulate invisible agents, invisible things are accumulated. We call them bacteria, viruses. So if we don't cleanse, then the teeth break down. If we don't wash, then the viruses have entry into our bodies. Nobody has ever seen a virus with their naked eye or a bacteria. But we know that certain ones are harmful to our health. They're not evil. They just have a different line of evolution, and the requirements for their health work against our own. So we cleanse every day. So similarly, every single day, and really every moment, we are continually in contact with, again, unseen agencies that we attract to ourselves, just like with the foods that we eat that cling to our teeth. There are other foods that we eat, that we feed our minds, that we feed our emotions, that accumulate. And sufficient accumulation leads to disease of different sorts, where the mind is corrupted and misdirected. So daily, we focus on, just as we cleanse the body, we cleanse the mind. And in the world in which we live, in today's world, more than half the world now is focused in cities. So we are in high concentrations of other people's thoughts, other people's emotions, other people's actions that are continually reacting upon us, even when we're unaware. I know Jeffrey Hodson used to speak about just the simple act of taking a shower in the morning or in the evening. But whenever you take a shower, for him it wasn't just a matter of putting on soap and washing off whatever the accumulations were of the day. I mean, for Jeffrey Hodson, he spoke about in the morning when we awake, prior to a time of a period of meditation, for instance, meditation practice, that it is helpful to wash, to shower, in his way of expressing it, to wash off the magnetism of sleep. Again, unseen, but very much there. So also the idea that in the act of cleansing the body, we can incorporate the act of a visual aspect, where we are in our imaginations, washing away all of the accumulations that have found their way into our thoughts and into our minds. At one point, I can remember having a workshop that I was doing with someone, and I don't know where the idea came, but I had a glass of water. And somewhere outside, I had picked up some sticks and some leaves and little pieces of dirt. And I dropped it into the glass of water and stirred it. And in stirring the glass of water, of course, what began as a clear glass that you could see through, crystal clear, with all of these impurities that had been dropped into it, and with the stirring action that was involved, the water was muddied, completely unclear, unable to see through it. Put the glass to the side, and we talked about this process as an example of what's happening in our own mind. Certain things get dropped in, whether of our choosing or not. Through the activity of the mind, they stay in motion and create a cloud. Talked about the idea, talked about the principle behind it. And then, talked for maybe 15, 20 minutes. Everyone forgot about the glass. But then held up the glass. And what became apparent is this, that the action of continually stirring these things kept them suspended, kept them clouding the clarity of the mind. But given a very short time where they were not being stirred, they dropped to the bottom. And once again, except for those few ones that still remained suspended in the water, once again you had clear water with the sediment at the bottom. So the idea is this, that regularly, every day, we have to create for ourselves periods of quiet, periods that allow the mind to become uncluttered by the accumulations of lifetimes. But gradually, as these things are able to settle to their own level, and as we cease to interact with those things, the mind starts to take on a quality of clarity. Out of this kind of experimentation and regularly introducing ourselves to periods of quiet, then we start to find that it has an effect on the capacity of the mind to see and to see clearly. And without that as a beginning point, then everything else has no real value. The great Buddhist saint Nagarjuna made the statement that without the discipline of protecting the mind, of what use is any other discipline? And so this is where we begin. Cleansing, purifying, clearing by the process of learning how to cultivate quiet. And quiet can then move toward stillness. Stillness can then be completely absorbed into an actual silence, genuine meditation. But it has to have a beginning point. And so the next thing, this is a beginning point as we get some level of clarity. Part of an additional process that feeds this cleansing process is, again, can be expressed quite simply, and it's something of which we are all aware. I mean, there is this expression that probably all of us have heard. Generally, you don't hear it expressed in discussions about the spiritual life, but it should be. And the expression is this, that you are what you eat. And it's an idea that had been expressed, predominantly in discussions about physical health and about the body. The knowledge that if you eat junk food, that in many ways it distorts the functioning of the body, and junk food leads to junk health conditions, leads to health problems, and so on. So if you live on McDonald's, then you can expect to become essentially what you eat. You're clouded by the sorts of emotions that come with all of the things perhaps related to animal foods. You're clouded by the preparation, you're clouded by the chemical additives. That part's obvious. Diet. You are what you eat. And this is a principle. Again, we come back to the Hermetic axiom, as it is above, so it is below, as it is without, so it is within. It's true of the function of the body. But it is equally true, and perhaps even more true, because of the increased levels of power that come as we go deeper within. So it's more true when applied to the mind and to our thought, that we are what we eat in terms of the thoughts that we consume. Again, relating it to that Mahatma letter, that we are continually peopling our current in space, but we have the capacity, when we have some degree of clarity, to choose, and hopefully to choose wisely. So to the degree that we find ourselves attracted to and immersed in some of the very popular imagery of violence, of harm, of all those sorts of things that are ever present in popular culture, then the diet of violence necessarily breeds fear or aggression within us. And so we respond and we cultivate ever more fears, aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts. Similarly, if we can focus our minds, if in our cleansing process we become sufficiently clear to know that there is a certain power that we find ourselves experiencing when we put ourselves within the realm of a certain way of thinking, then we find we do that more. This is the idea that's given of, in the Theosophical tradition, we talk about the practice, the spiritual practice being study, meditation, service. So the study, the nature of the thoughts, the ideas that we feed the mind. This is this study aspect. And so we develop for ourselves what we determine to be a healthy diet. And it reacts upon the emotions. And so gradually what we find is that with this new diet, at a certain point, many of the toxins that have been a part of our normal way of thinking and living become expelled. And so there is less and less of that sort of material within the body that is being created by this diet. You are what you eat, whether it's through your mouth or through your mind. So that's a second thing. So then, what do we do? The fact of this particular moment in which we find ourselves is that there is great uncertainty, and it's global. It's not just a matter of this country or that. There is a profound uncertainty, in many ways a profound sense of a polarizing influence that is in the world. There are genuine crises of various sorts that are looming on the very near horizon. We already find ourselves experiencing one that was completely unexpected by the mass of people, this sort of global pandemic. And so we become aware of global influences within which we participate. And so for many, it is something that emphasizes to them a sense of powerlessness. We're all so small. We are small things, less than a grain of sand on a beach. So what can we do? This is one way of thinking. For those who have found their way to the ageless wisdom tradition, we know that the potential power that can be generated and the influence that can be generated in the world by a person who aligns themselves with what Rumi called as love. We don't seek for love, but you have the experience of this unifying force, clarifying force, as we engage in this process of clearing and as we engage in the process. With the process, the possibility of the actual experience becomes real. And so then what we need to do while we are drawing ever nearer is again to develop a deepening practice. And I find myself more and more emphasizing this possibility. I have said, and you think about it for yourself, but from my point of view, any person and every person who genuinely commits themselves to the unfoldment of their consciousness, to what we would describe as a spiritual life or a spiritual path, anyone and everyone who makes that commitment at some point necessarily becomes a healer. And by healer, I mean a healer in the sense of the true sense of the word. We're not talking about just someone who can remove physical conditions, although that is something that does in fact occur. But healing in the sense of the actual meaning of the word to heal. To heal is to bring wholeness. It is the restoration of wholeness. It is the ability to convey the possibility to be relieved from the fragmentation of these multiple sorts of identities, these wrong self-knowledge that is our inheritance from many, many lives of going in an improper direction. We become relieved of that ourselves, and in that process, it becomes something that can be meaningfully, actually conveyed to others. And in some ways, we do it by, again, cultivating a practice that every day we find ourselves centering. We find ourselves becoming engaged in this cleansing process of stilling the mind. And in that centering, we are able to actually generate what begins as a wish for the well-being of others, for the well-being of the world, for the introduction within the hearts of others, perhaps many for the first time in a lifetime, of the experience of the unifying quality, the non-separative quality of this thing that we call love, deep, profound, impersonal. And so these are ideas for shaping the mind. In this particular moment in which we find ourselves living, it is the obligation, really. I mean, of course, we all make our choices. But it is the obligation of anyone who claims even an interest in what they might describe as the spiritual life to commit to the cultivation of what begins as qualities and then has the possibility to actually become not even just a way of living, but it just simply becomes who we are. And at that point, I think the formula self-knowledge is of loving acts the child begins to become meaningful to us. Know thyself, the longest journey to the nearest goal. But with this process, we can shorten it. With this approach, processes in and of themselves do not create enlightenment, but they put us in the neighborhood. So once again, merci, mes amis. And in some lifetime in the perhaps not too distant future, I will be speaking to you entirely in French. Hopefully then you won't all be speaking English. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tim, for your sharing. And I would like to say now, speak in French to our friends. Merci infiniment, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Tim, d'avoir pris le temps de partager avec nous vos réflexions sur ce sujet important que vous avez décortiqué sous le titre « Modeler le mental selon l'instant ». Je rappelle aux auditeurs maintenant qu'il y aura une session de partage et de questions. Profitez de l'occasion pour poser vos questions au Président. Est-il possible de détailler un peu plus, je cite, l'esprit le plus élevé et la matière la plus basse sont liés par le mental, fin de citation, ainsi que ce qui a été évoqué de la triade monadique, manasique, physique, évoquée. You can translate
the question is to elaborate on that, or?
Yes, yes.
It's just a question asking, is it possible to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah.
The higher spirit and the lower matter connected by the mind.
Yeah.
And also what you mentioned about the triad monadic, monastic,
and physical, yeah. Over the years of study and thinking and meditation about many of these deep theosophical ideas, I have come to certain conclusions that work for me.
Le long de toutes ces années ou tous ces temps où j'ai considéré et étudié toutes ces matières, je suis arrivée à plusieurs conclusions.
And to me, really, this idea of what is it that is a human being, spirit, mind, body, or physical, is probably one of the most important.
Et probablement la question de cette question de qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un être humain, le physique, le mental et le spirituel, c'est probablement la question la plus importante.
it really defines for us how and what it is we can do in this effort we describe as the spiritual life, the life of unfoldment, the search for enlightenment.
Parce que cela définit pour nous le comment et ce que nous pouvons faire pour atteindre finalement l'illumination.
Our focus as people of a spiritual disposition tends to be on highest spirit.
Les personnes qui veulent ou qui sont focalisées sur le développement spirituel c'est cette question, c'est qu'ils veulent atteindre les niveaux les plus élevés de développement.
Really the highest spirit. Highest spirit.
Les niveaux les plus élevés de l'esprit.
And many traditions try to train us in the removal of consciousness from the physical.
Il y a beaucoup de traditions qui prônent ou recommandent l'élimination,
l'éloignement de la conscience physique.
De la conscience physique.
De la conscience du physique.
De la conscience du physique.
So this is the dilemma that people throughout the ages find themselves in. Attracted to spirit, denying of the physical, and largely unaware of the bridging space, which is the mind.
Donc, ce qui arrive normalement, c'est qu'il y a une forte attirance vers le spirituel, vers l'esprit, la négation du physique et une ignorance de ce qui les réunit toutes les deux, qui est le mental.
So the human being, again, as described in the Ageless Wisdom, is all of these three elements: highest spirit, lowest mind, lowest matter, but the linking agency is the all-important area where we find ourselves, this whole area of the mind.
Donc, dans ce composé des trois éléments, le spirituel et le physique, unis par le mental, cet agent qui connecteur, est vraiment ce qui est important, et c'est le mental.
Because really, we, in our normal consciousness, we really know nothing about spirit, and we equally know little about matter.
Parce que dans notre niveau de conscience, en vérité, nous connaissons très peu de l'esprit, du spirit. Nous ne connaissons rien de l'esprit et nous connaissons très peu de la matière.
Just for a scientific example, the science of today says that about 98% of what makes up the universe, they are now describing as dark matter. They cannot see it, they cannot find it, but they know that it must be there for the universe to behave as it does. We know nothing of that.
En tant qu'exemple, la science d'aujourd'hui affirme que 90% de ce qui existe dans l'univers est la matière noire, on dit matière noire,
Dark, right?
sombre, parce qu'on n'en sait rien, on ne la voit pas et on ne la trouve pas, donc de toute façon, cependant, elle doit bien être là. Il faut qu'elle y soit.
So the area where we have to focus our attention is on cultivating this mind that touches spirit, that touches matter, and that makes it possible to be fully human beings. That's the focus.
Donc, ce qui est vraiment le point important, c'est de nous focaliser dans ce mental qui touche l'esprit et qui touche la matière et qui fait que nous soyons un être humain complet.
So really that's the point of trying to elaborate through this particular talk, just to bring our focus once again to that area over which we have the most control and over which we can exercise some sort of development that brings us together as really a total human being, spiritual, mental, physical.
Donc, ce que j'ai essayé avec ma causerie d'aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment d'attirer l'attention sur cette partie sur laquelle on a le plus grand contrôle, où on peut avoir le plus grand contrôle et qu'on peut exercer au maximum afin de unifier ou de connecter les trois parties et de devenir un être humain complet.
Une autre qui vient, qui dit, vous avez parlé de pureté, de santé et restez paisible afin de comprendre les blocages qui ne permettent pas la connexion. Pensez-vous que cette situation de Covid nous aide à le faire?
Shall I translate for you?
A little bit, yeah.
Donc, you have talked about purity, about health and being calm, so that we can understand the barriers that prevent us the connection.
Experiencing reality or consciousness.
Yeah. Et la dernière partie de la question, Kim Diu, je ne l'ai pas sur l'écran.
Oui. Est-ce que tu veux que je répète la question?
Non,
The last part about the COVID aspect, could you?
Yes.
Pensez-vous que cette situation créée par le Covid nous aide à le faire, à faire ce que vous avez parlé avant, purifier, etc.
Donc,
So could this approach be something helpful in this dealing with this COVID?
no, it's the other way around. Do you think that the situation of this COVID can help us to do what you recommend?
It's a good question. I sometimes come back to this. Sometimes I think it's unfortunate, but as human beings, it seems we learn most deeply in times of crisis.
Malheureusement, il semblerait que, en tant qu'être humain, on apprend le plus seulement ou particulièrement dans des temps de crise, dans des situations de crise.
I think if everyone kind of looks back at their own life, the moments that you had the most profound sorts of insights often were coupled with those moments when there was also the greatest losses, loss of loved ones, loss of employment, different things like that.
À penser par exemple à la vie de chacun, quand on regarde en perspective, avec la perspective du temps, la vie passée, la vie que nous avons vécue, on se rend compte que les moments de conscience ou de perception plus profonde sont des moments qui se produisent en même temps que de grosses pertes, des pertes de par la mort ou de l'emploi ou des trucs comme ça.
And I think particularly when we have situations that actually threaten our lives even, then I think those are moments where we become much more focused and ask deeper questions.
Et je pense même que quand nous nous retrouvons dans des situations, dans des moments dangereux qui nous menacent
notre vie.
Et qui menacent notre vie,
Même.
c'est en ces moments où on est capable de focaliser plus profondément et d'arriver à ces questions plus profondes.
And certainly this COVID pandemic is such a moment.
Et certainement, cette pandémie du Covid est un de ces moments.
So what I encourage, there are profound truths that can be applied in these ageless wisdom teachings.
Donc, il y a des vérités très profondes que nous pouvons appliquer à cette sagesse éternelle.
So what we have to take it upon ourselves to do is to experiment. If it's true, we must verify it for ourselves. And from that, we can deepen in our understanding and deepen in our effectiveness in helping in this world.
Donc, ce qu'il nous faut faire, c'est expérimenter, faire l'expérience et chercher à voir est-ce que c'est vrai et vérifier ceci, parce que ceci va nous permettre d'approfondir notre compréhension et notre effectivité dans notre service dans le monde.
So during the course of the things that I said said today, I tried to focus on three things in particular.
Donc, d'après les choses que j'ai dit avant, j'ai essayé d'insister ou de signaler trois points spécifiques ou importants.
And really three things, but there is an unspoken fourth thing that is all important.
Donc, il s'agit de trois choses, mais en réalité, il y en a une quatrième dont on ne parle pas, mais qui est toujours là.
So the three, of course, were cleansing or purifying, attention to mental, diet, physical as well, and then healing.
Donc, les trois choses étaient le nettoyage, la purification, après une diète mentale et physique, et aussi la guérison.
The fourth, without which any of those others are useless, is that there must be an application of will. There must be a commitment that is made that focuses our direction.
Le quatrième, sans lequel les trois autres ne peuvent pas exister ou ne vont nulle part, c'est l'application. Il est nécessaire, il faut qu'il y ait une application de la volonté, d'engagement vers la direction vers laquelle il faut aller.
And with that commitment, it will be found that results will arise from the effort put into these three things. Results that you can verify for yourself and then expand upon.
Et avec cet engagement, on va voir que des résultats vont se produire à partir de l'effort. Nous verrons ces résultats.
The whole basis of the ageless wisdom tradition, theosophy, is not the transference of information. That's a very small part of its value and its importance.
Les fondements ou la base de la tradition théosophique n'est pas le transfert de connaissances ou d'informations. Ceci a un rôle très, très petit dans toute l'histoire.
Within the ageless wisdom teachings, all of us will find that there are teachings that appeal to us immediately. They speak to something deep that is of the nature of an inner experience of our own.
Dans la tradition de la sagesse éternelle, de l'enseignement de la sagesse éternelle, on trouve certainement qu'il y a des aspects où il y a des enseignements qui nous parlent, qui nous attirent spécialement et immédiatement parce que ces enseignements résonnent dans une partie très profonde de nous-mêmes.
There are other teachings, and they are many, that for whatever reason we do not resonate. We do not understand. It is not within the realm of our experience.
Mais il y a d'autres enseignements que nous ne comprenons pas et qui ne résonnent pas en nous aucunement.
So the role for us is the same one that the Buddha spoke about when he said, do not accept anything that does not accord with your own common sense, your own experience. He said, even if I, the Buddha, said it, don't accept it.
Alors, il faut tenir compte de ce que Bouddha a dit quand il a conseillé de ne pas suivre ou de ne pas accepter quoi que ce soit qui ne résonne pas en nous ou qui ne résonne pas dans notre propre expérience, même si c'est moi qui le dis.
So the role for us again is the things we do understand, we magnify. The things we do not, we remain open. And at some point, perhaps it will be something that resonates, perhaps not, but we remain open.
Donc, il s'agit d'accepter ou de comprendre, de voir les choses que nous comprenons et qui résonnent en nous et les choses que nous ne comprenons pas et qui ne résonnent pas en nous. Il faut rester ouvert, avec un mental ouvert. Peut-être que un jour, on commencera à comprendre, mais tant que cela n'arrive pas, il faut rester ouvert.
So this COVID pandemic moment is not in any way different from any other moment, except now we realize that at every moment our life is threatened. At every moment, we need to be more aware.
Donc, le moment actuel de ce Covid, de cette pandémie, n'est aucunement différent de n'importe quel autre moment. La seule différence, c'est que maintenant, on réalise, on se rend compte que chaque moment est une menace.
At any moment,
Yes.
our lives are threatened.
And-
Now that we realize, we focus.
Yes. So I said that.
Oh, une autre question qui est tout à fait dans le sujet, là. Vous avez parlé, monsieur le Président, de guérisseur en cherchant la connaissance de soi. Si j'ai bien compris, est-ce que cela veut dire qu'en cherchant la connaissance de soi, nous nous guérissons nous-mêmes et par extension, nous serions capables de guérir du moins en partie les autres?
C'est une question que... Ah, pardon.
The question relates to healing.
Yes,
If I
you have
understand
talked
it
about
properly.
the act of healing, and just while in looking for the self-knowledge, now the question is, do you mean that by doing this, we would heal ourselves, and by that, we can heal also the others?
Yeah, I think that's a very clear way of putting it, that in the process of removing our obstacles to truth, to love, that we become healed. Our fragmentation leaves, we become whole.
Oui, c'est dans le procès d'enlever les obstacles qui dans le chemin vers l'amour, on devient une unité sans fragmentation.
And that is, by definition, that is what healing is, the restoration of wholeness.
Et par définition, la guérison, c'est ça, c'est la restauration de l'unité, de la totalité.
During my life, I have known some people who were very powerful healers of a variety of types.
Au long de ma vie, j'ai rencontré plusieurs personnes, plusieurs guérisseurs très puissants de différentes sortes.
I have known people who can remove conditions of disease quite powerfully in many cases, not all.
J'ai connu des personnes qui pouvaient enlever les causes d'une maladie d'une façon très puissante. Pas toujours, mais presque toujours.
I've also known people that would have people come to them on the last phases of living, where they're at the verge of dying from disease.
Et aussi, j'ai connu des personnes qui sont venues à eux au dernier moment de leur vie, quand ils étaient sur le point de mourir.
Some of those people I have known to have been healed even in their physical condition.
Et j'en connais deux de ces personnes-là qui ont été guéries, même physiquement, malgré les déplorables conditions.
Others I have known to experience a feeling of deep contentment and deep peace in the face of the awareness that this illness will not go away, that they are in fact on the verge of death.
Et j'ai connu aussi d'autres personnes qui, même s'ils étaient sur le point de mourir, ils étaient dans un état d'esprit très calme, très d'acceptation, par le fait qu'ils allaient mourir.
To my mind, each of these were profound healings. The one that stayed to live a little longer, and the one that passed with a mind at ease.
Donc pour moi, les deux cas seraient des cas de guérison. Celui qui s'est récupéré et a pu vivre un peu plus longtemps, et celui qui est décédé, mais dans des conditions très paisibles mentalement.
So with the unfoldment of our own, with a deepening connection to our true self, we become active in this way, in our families, in our workplace, in our nation.
Donc, avec quand on a une condition approfondie, une connexion approfondie avec nous-mêmes, on peut devenir ce genre de guérisseur dans notre entourage, dans notre famille, dans notre travail, dans le monde.
Mm-hmm. And really, in part, this is the role of this whole theosophical work.
Et en partie, c'est là le rôle du monde théosophique.
Du travail théosophique.
Le travail, du monde théosophique.
For those of us who find value in it, to become sufficiently aware that wherever we find ourselves in the world, we are a healing presence.
We are a healing process.
Presence.
Presence, sorry. Donc, pour nous, le rôle que nous avons, c'est de être conscient que nous sommes, où que nous soyons, nous pouvons être une présence guérissante.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Très bien. Encore une autre question. Il y a encore plusieurs questions encore à venir. Question. Vous avez parlé de nettoyer, purifier nos différents corps, de diète physique et mentale et de guérison. À quoi cela mène-t-il ensuite? Est-ce cela spiritualiser la matière? À quoi cela mène-t-elle, cette spiritualisation de la matière?
You have talked about cleaning, purifying our different bodies, the physical diet and the mental diet, and healing. Where all this takes us to? Does this mean that it's a spiritualization of the matter? And this spiritualization of matter, where does it bring us to?
Okay. Again, probably the better answer would be try it and then you tell me.
Probablement la meilleure réponse serait essayer et après vous me racontez. Venez me raconter.
Because these are many ideas: spiritualizing matter, materializing spirit. But those are ideas that sometimes can be more confusing than they can be helpful.
Parce que il y a beaucoup d'idées comme par exemple spiritualiser la matière ou matérialiser l'esprit et toute cette sorte de raisonnement peut ne faire que compliquer les choses.
In the yoga tradition, Purusha is described, Purusha is the name for spirit, Prakriti is the name for matter. And there is a very clear example given of this process of the meeting, coming together of spirit and matter.
Dans le yoga, on parle de Purusha qui est l'esprit et Prakriti qui est la matière. Et on peut retrouver toutes les explications de ce processus d'union entre l'esprit et la matière.
And the process is described as the purpose of the coming together of these two. Essentially, it's so that in interacting, the qualities in each can be drawn out. The qualities of spirit can be drawn out and magnified in its interaction with matter, and the same thing for matter. Its qualities become drawn out in the process of interacting with spirit.
Ceci veut dire que la raison d'être de cette union entre Purusha et Prakriti, la matière et l'esprit, c'est l'interaction, que par l'interaction des deux, les qualités de chacune sont
Revealed, we can say.
Révélées, se manifester, et c'est par cela.
So matter does not become spiritualized. Spirit does not become materialized, but in the interactions, qualities that would lay dormant awaken.
Donc la matière n'est pas spiritualisée, ne devient pas spiritualisée, et l'esprit ne devient pas matière ou n'est pas matérialisé, mais dans le processus de cette interaction, les qualités qui dormantes ou latentes se manifestent, viennent à la manifestation.
Now, there is a question in English. Unless you would translate it into French for our friends. Can you please share your own experience related to the discipline of protecting and cleansing the mind? For example, meditation, which is the first part of the formula. I can understand what the questioner wants to mean about the word formula. But the main question is, can you share your experience related to the discipline of protecting and cleaning the mind, etc., for example, with meditation?
Est-ce que vous pouvez partager votre propre expérience qui a à voir avec la discipline de la protection et nettoyage du mental, par exemple la méditation? C'est ça, non?
Oui.
I should make clear the quote that I gave from Nagarjuna, where he says, without the discipline of protecting the mind, what use is any other discipline?
Il faut dire que la citation que j'ai donnée était de Nagarjuna quand il dit que s'il n'y a pas de protection du mental, n'importe quoi que vous fassiez n'a aucun effet.
But it was said about a very specific thing. It's a general principle, but he was speaking specifically about mantra.
C'est un principe général, mais lui, il parlait à propos d'une chose très, très particulière, il parlait des mantras.
So in terms of this, the various methods, various agencies we can employ for protecting the mind, this is one, mantra.
Donc, entre toutes ces choses ou disciplines qu'on peut utiliser pour protéger le mental, il y a les mantras.
Also, I often find I need to make the point, very often we speak about meditation.
Il faut bien noter, très souvent on parle de méditation.
When really what we are speaking of is the practice of meditation.
Mais en réalité, on parle de la pratique de la méditation.
A pianist who is playing scales is practicing playing music. He is not playing music when he's practicing scales.
Le pianiste qui fait des escales, on dit escales? Des gammes, voilà. Qui fait des gammes à son piano, il pratique la musique, il ne fait pas de musique. Il la pratique.
Similarly, what we do in general when we pay attention to the breath, when we focus on a seed thought, is we practice bringing the mind to stillness.
Donc souvent, normalement, quand on fait attention à la respiration ou quand on fait attention à une idée semence, ce qu'on fait, c'est une pratique. On est en train de pratiquer à calmer le mental.
And as a general rule, that's often as far as it goes. We find different thoughts intruding, our mind is taken away, but we practice.
Donc, en général, on ne va pas plus loin. On est conscient, on voit les idées qui entrent dans notre mental et on les laisse passer. Et ce qu'on fait, c'est pratiquer. Calmer.
But then there are those moments that occur of actual genuine meditation, which can occur when we are seated doing our practice, or which very often occur when we are not seated in meditation practice.
Et après, il y a ces moments très profonds qui arrivent à des moments où normalement on n'est pas assis pour pratiquer la méditation.
Parfois, yes, parfois non.
Mais parfois, ils arrivent aussi quand on est assis à pratiquer la méditation.
And these are moments that are always quite memorable to us because of the sense of expansion and the absence of focus or even awareness of ourselves.
The absence of that.
Absence of sense of self.
Yeah, sure. Mais alors, il y a aussi des moments qui se produisent où il y a et qui sont mémorables, hein, parce qu'il se produit une expansion dans laquelle il y a une absence de focalisation de nous-mêmes.
Mm-hmm. And really the moment that we become aware of this expansiveness, of this sense of illumination, transparency, is the very moment when we lose the experience.
Et alors, au moment où on devient conscient de ce sens d'illumination ou d'expansion, c'est le moment où on perd l'expérience.
Because we, through the process of noticing through the mind, we again inject the self, which diminishes the experience.
Parce que du moment où on focalise le mental dans l'expérience, on est en train de faire diminuer, de rapetisser on injecte notre soi, notre ego, et l'expérience devient plus petite. limité.
So the practice is exceedingly important, but we must not ever mistake the practice for genuine illumination or enlightenment.
Alors, la pratique est absolument importante, mais il ne faut jamais confondre la pratique avec la vraie illumination.
There are still one or two questions. The first one, I will read it in English. It is not in the tonality of in tune with our talking here, but probably the person are seeking for some help. Hello from the Philippines. Just I want to ask why sometimes we have cravings, such as chips, junk food, for women. This usually happens during moon days or when we have our thing. Can this be controlled? Thank you very much. It is cravings.
En français, tu veux que je traduise?
Bon, si tu veux, moi j'ai la question écrite devant. Alors, bonjour des Philippines. Je voudrais juste demander que comment se fait-il que de temps en temps, on a des désirs incontrôlables sur les nourritures junk food, comme des chips, etc. Alors, comment est-ce qu'on peut faire? Est-ce qu'on peut contrôler ces mouvements de désir?
Probably one of the profound difficulties with this whole self-transformation and self-knowledge process is that we are very complex beings.
Il est probablement difficile quand on parle de la transformation de soi, du processus de la transformation de soi, parce que nous sommes en réalité des êtres très complexes. Oh, oui, des êtres très complexes.
All of the influences of the spiritual influences of the mind, of the emotions, and the body's needs and desires all come together in this thing that we call me.
Toutes les influences de tous les aspects émotionnels, du mental et spirituel et physique se rassemblent dans cette entité qu'on appelle moi.
And so the physical body makes very strong demands upon us. Very often there is this expression in English, maybe it's another language, that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The squeaky wheel is the one that's lubricated. The thing making the most noise is the thing we give our attention to.
Très souvent, dans l'aspect physique, on a des demandes. Très souvent, le physique, c'est la partie la plus exigeante, celle qui exige le plus, qui demande le plus. Et ce qu'on dit en anglais, c'est que normalement, on fait attention, on fait plus attention à ces parties qui
à la roue,
Fait de grand bruit.
qui
fait plus de bruit.
qui font du bruit parce que par manque de lubrifiant. Et c'est à ces parties-là qu'on fait le plus attention, plus qu'aux autres.
So it's true. The body makes its demands. And the way we respond is by saying, when the body is hungry, our statement is, I am hungry. When the emotions are disturbed, the statement we make is, I am angry. I am sad. That's something we need to look at.
Il faut donc prendre conscience et être attentif au fait que quand notre corps a faim, ce qu'on dit c'est « moi j'ai faim ». Et quand nos émotions sont troublées et on dit « moi je suis content » ou « moi je suis fâché ». Et il faut faire attention à ceci.
One of the purposes well, it has health purposes, but also in the spiritual life, there's great emphasis across traditions placed on fasting.
Et il y a une chose qui est importante, non seulement dans le domaine de la santé, mais aussi dans le domaine spirituel, et c'est le jeûner.
Because what we find is that in the process of withdrawing from, of becoming aware of these demands, then a deepening awareness occurs. When we say, for a period, I will not eat, you become much more aware of the body as the one that is speaking.
Parce que dans ce processus, quand il se produit cette, comment on dit, cette manquance, ce manque de quoi que ce soit, que ce soit nourriture ou quoi que ce soit, et on devient conscient de cette demande, de cette demande de la part du corps, par exemple. Et alors, on dit non, un point c'est tout, fini, je ne vais pas te donner ce que tu demandes.
An even stronger demand today that we really only fully become aware of how much we are engaged in is if you were to ask somebody to put down your screen, your cell phone. The reactions are very similar to those withdrawing from drugs.
De nos jours, il y a encore une demande ou une nécessité plus forte. C'est le portable, le téléphone et qui nous attache. Et donc, il devient très difficile de laisser tomber ou de laisser de côté l'écran.
C'est comme les drogues.
Et c'est
So
comme
the idea of all of this is that Colonel Olcott used to smoke cigars. Blavatsky used to smoke cigarettes. But Olcott, people told him, you know, you shouldn't smoke. It's not good for you.
Donc, dans les personnages que nous connaissons, Olcott et Blavatsky, les deux, ils avaient l'habitude de fumer. Et les gens leur disaient, mais vous savez, il faut vraiment...
Response was that as a habit, if it is something that I cannot stop, I must stop. But if I can continue.
OK. Alors, leur réponse, c'était, comme c'est une habitude, si c'est une habitude que je ne peux pas arrêter, alors il faut absolument que je l'arrête. Mais si c'est une habitude que je peux arrêter facilement, alors je peux continuer.
The key factor, of course, is becoming aware. As we become aware of these things, we can choose to engage, to withdraw. As long as it operates beneath the level of our awareness, the habits, the desires control us.
De devenir, d'être conscient de ce parce qu'à un moment-là, on a la possibilité de choisir vraiment de se détacher de cette étude.
Yeah.
That's good.
Ah oui, et que je n'ai pas conscient de ça.
The last but one question is from India. It is in English, so Angel, please translate it into French. From the esoteric viewpoint, has COVID-19 given an opportunity to the human race to renegotiate their living lifestyle?
Donc,
I think the President has answered partly this already. Est-ce que ça va?
Oui, du point de vue ésotérique, est-ce que...
Ésotérique?
Oui.
COVID
Tu le dis?
Has given us an opportunity to the human race to renegotiate the living lifestyle.
Je le dis en français?
Vas-y, tu entends?
Du point de vue ésotérique, est-ce que le Covid-19 a donné l'occasion à la race humaine de renégocier son style de vie?
Yeah, this is, of course, something that is very true. It is correct that our lifestyles are being reshaped.
Il est vrai et c'est correct de dire que nos styles de vie ont été reconstitués ou changés ou remaniés.
And this is again, at a superficial level, we are washing our hands more. We are distancing ourselves physically from others. These are renegotiated lifestyles at the superficial level.
Donc, dans le niveau superficiel, il est vrai qu'on a changé parce qu'on se lave plus les mains, on garde les distances entre les gens et ceci vraiment est quelque chose qui est différent de ce que nous avions l'habitude de faire au niveau superficiel.
At deeper levels, we find people responding in different ways.
Dans des niveaux plus profonds, on voit des gens qui répondent de façon différente.
For those who find this a fearful moment and whose behavior and defenses are dictated by fear, they behave in one way.
Pour ceux qui ont la sensation ou le sentiment d'être dans des moments de peur, pour ceux qui sont peureux, ils ont une réaction qui répond à cette peur.
And the always reaction, fearful reaction, is either to fight, to flee, or just to freeze. These are the reactions that fear induces.
OK. Et la réaction normale de par la peur, c'est ou bien la lutte, ou bien il se sauve, il s'échappe, ou bien il reste figé.
But there seems to be, at least we hope, that there is a growing number of people who are looking even deeper.
Mais on a l'espoir qu'il va y avoir un plus grand nombre de personnes qui vont considérer cela d'une façon plus profonde encore.
Probably the deepest teaching in this esoteric tradition is the fact or the teaching about unity, oneness.
Probablement Et l'enseignement le plus profond dans les enseignements de la tradition théosophique, c'est le sujet de l'unité.
And for those who are looking at it more profoundly, the fact of human unity is something that this pandemic has only served to deepen.
Et pour ceux qui recherchent ou que veulent voir ce facteur de l'unité humaine, hein,
La pandémie,
cette pandémie a aidé à chercher ou à approfondir encore plus.
So the reorganizations of lifestyle is something that is still growing in this sense of the inner life.
Donc, la réorganisation de du style de vie est quelque chose qui se produit et qui est de plus en plus profonde, ou qui s'approfondit dans nos vies.
So exactly what form that will take is something that we are witnessing now. And hopefully it's something that we are also involved in shaping by our own inner behavior.
Donc, le changement en vue, c'est quelque chose que nous sommes en train de voir et c'est certainement quelque chose que nous pouvons projeter dans un futur
et expérimenter dans notre développement interne.
et expérimenter dans notre développement interne.
Okay. Merci.
Très bien. Alors, nous allons procéder donc à la dernière question. Et nous nous excusons d'avance de ne pouvoir traiter les autres pour différentes raisons. L'heure tourne. Aussi, nous ne voulons pas prendre trop de temps à notre président parce qu'il faut aller à la fin de notre convention. Donc, les gens qui ont déjà posé ces questions-là, ils vont réaliser que ou bien c'est déjà répondu partiellement, ou bien la question n'est pas assez claire, il faut reformuler et puis dans une autre session, nous pouvons traiter. Donc, la dernière question se lit: comment quelqu'un qui n'a pas cette intention de prise de conscience peut-il évoluer? Est-il perdu à jamais?
Do you understand or shall I translate?
Let me just recap in English. How can someone who does not have this approach and this point
intention of,
how can they evolve? Are they just simply lost?
or lost forever?
No. First of all, this is, we make choices. And in any choice that we make, the world does keep turning, whether we choose one way or another. And the sun does still shine, no matter what our choice is.
Donc, il n'est pas perdu à jamais parce que on fait des choix et le monde continue à tourner et le soleil continue à apparaître, etc.
We are, all of us are engaged in a process of unfoldment, evolution.
Et nous sommes tous engagés dans un processus de développement évolutif.
And there are individual choices that can make this process go faster or slower, but the thing we cannot lose sight of, it is one humanity that is unfolding.
Donc, il y a des personnes qui peuvent, il y a des moyens pour accélérer le processus. Il y a des personnes qui à accélérer, il y en a d'autres qui le ralentissent, mais en principe, tout continue et il ne faut pas perdre de vue qu'on est une seule humanité, un processus de développement.
And even for those who can see somewhat clearly and make the choice to try and speed up this development, it's not, ultimately, it is not for personal benefit.
Même ceux qui ont la capacité de voir un peu plus au-delà et qui accélèrent le processus, ce n'est pas pour eux qu'ils le font. Ce n'est pas une chose qui est un bénéfice personnel.
And again, and I'll just say this one more time, one thing we always try and should keep in mind, that we can use even the body as an example.
Donc, il y a quelque chose que je vais répéter encore une fois. Il faut tenir compte, nous pouvons utiliser comme un exemple même le corps physique.
Within the body, there are cellular structures that build up the body, and then there are those that tear down and cause useless material to be excreted.
Dans le corps humain, il y a ces parties qui construisent le corps, et après il y a ces parties qui font partie,
qui produisent des déchets.
Qui produisent des déchets qu'il faut expulser.
And both are required for the total human being to have a life. Similarly with the greater body that we describe as humanity.
Et les deux sont nécessaires pour la formation de ce corps un peu plus grand. Et de la même façon, il arrive avec ce corps encore plus grand qui est l'humanité.
C'est parfait. C'est parfait parce que nous avons, grâce au président, de finir de frapper une note tout à fait pour l'humanité, mais pas pour nous-mêmes. Il me reste maintenant, au nom de tous les participants, au nom aussi de notre présidente Nano Legué, qui est parmi les participants, et aussi de la part de notre section, de remercier chaleureusement notre président Tim Boyd pour son temps imparti pour nous, pour son éclaircissement des idées. Je remercie également Angeles qui nous a donné le plaisir de la voir et de participer à notre travail ici en France, alors qu'elle est déjà sous la charge de l'Espagne.